Good evening, everyone. I'm Kimberlé Crenshaw, Executive Director of the African American Policy Forum. Together with the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, we welcome you to the third film in our mini film festival, After Talk. And this is part of the fifth day of our annual series, Her Dream Deferred, a week on the status of Black women. Now, our objective in the Her Dream Deferred Mini Film Festival is to elevate films that are writing into what we have called the representational void enveloping Black women, girls, and femmes. Still I Rise, an incredible film by Sheri Shuster, builds poignant narratives of struggle and resistance while also uncovering disturbing truths about the inadequacy of law, of regulation, and constrained hope for our young girls today. So let's get started with this phenomenal group of women, beginning with the filmmaker and the principal subjects of the film. Sheri Shuster is a documentary film director and producer interested in advancing intersectional and moral conversations about race and power. An Iranian American and LA native, her commitment to human rights drew her into the world of public policy and storytelling. She's an alumnus of UCLA and the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington. Holly Joshi has been a committed community servant for 2 decades and a leader in the anti-trafficking and gender-based campaigns against violence for over a decade. She currently consults nationwide to develop anti-trafficking prevention and intervention strategies. Holly was an invited member of the then California Attorney General Kamala Harris's task force on human trafficking and task force on the 21st century policing. She's also a doctoral candidate in educational leadership at St. Mary's College of California. And finally, Leah Albright-Byrd is a speaker, an author, and a social entrepreneur. In 2011, she founded Bridget's Dream, a nonprofit that provided services to child and adult survivors of human trafficking. Now, while leading that effort, Leah became a national and international advocate for the cause, promoted legislative change, and appeared on various media outlets to promote public awareness. She eventually received a congressional honor, the MLK Difference Maker Award, for her activism, and was also featured in 2 documentaries, California's Forgotten Children, and of course, the film that we're anxious to talk about tonight, Still I Rise. So welcome all. I'm so excited to have this conversation. So let's just dive in. I'm going to start with you, Sheri, as the documentary filmmaker. So I want you to tell us a little bit about the origins of this film, what drew you to this topic, and importantly, how you came to the stories of Holly and Leah.
Thank you so much for having us here, Professor Crenshaw. It's really an honor to be here with you. My journey into the film, my background is actually in public policy, and between the year of 2008 and 2012, I had the honor of being an associate director at Covenant House, California in Oakland. And I got to work with and develop relationships, loving relationships with a lot of the youth there. And a lot of the youth there had been impacted by sex trafficking. At the time, I understood that this was like a growing problem in the United States. But what I didn't know was that, basically, 53% of girls who are trafficked in the US are African American. And we served, probably about 90% of the youth that we served there were African American. And so as I got to, understand just how deep and pervasive the issue was, in particular in African American communities, I was very confused by why nobody was reporting on this. Why was this not in the mainstream media? Why were advocates typically not talking about this and not centering the experiences and the lives of Black women and girls? And, most of the portrayals in the media were just very, just dehumanizing and objectifying and salacious. And, there's obviously, there's victim blaming that happens in a lot of gender-based violence, but I thought it was particularly intense when it came to Black girls and women. And so, when I finished Covenant House in 2012, with no background in film, I knew that there had to be more that I can do, and as a child who also had been systems involved, I made a promise to myself when I was a young girl and said, if I'm ever in a position to do more, I will. And so in 2013, I picked up a camera and I bought a Mac computer, and I was like, okay, if not me, then, who's telling the stories of these girls,
So let me just see if did I hear you right? This is your first film?
Yes.
Amazing. I mean, awesome, amazing. Thank you. And what I'm also hearing, I often say this just about my own work. I wasn't drawn to being a law professor and an academic because I just want to sit in the ivory tower and think ideas, right? It's not that. It's the work, the stories, the inequalities that I wanted to address, and being a law professor was the medium through which I did that and do that. And it sounds like the same for you. It was first the work that you wanted to do, the stories that you wanted to lift up, the people that you wanted to address and whose stories needed to be addressed in order to do that. And you chose film as a way to do it. I would imagine, as a first-time filmmaker, addressing an issue and people who have been so thoroughly underrepresented and misrepresented, that you encountered a lot of challenges in trying to do that. Can you share some of them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my first objective was to do no harm. And I realized also, just coming from like a, sort of feminist ethnographic sort of background, I really made a very conscious effort to not do anything that felt extractive or re-exploitative. So the first year when I started making the film, I also started volunteering at MISSY, which is one of the pioneering anti-trafficking agencies. And I volunteered my time for 5 hours a week and worked with the executive director on fundraising and board development. I firmly believe that everybody involved in the film should also be benefiting and uplifted by the film. And so in every, throughout the process, I really put, the idea of reciprocity and friendship essentially at the center.
Well, and I just want to bear witness to your resourcefulness, your urgency, your ability to frame the imperative of making this film in a way that recruited people, me, to be a part of it, because it's clearly not easy to do this kind of work. And you have to have the passion for it. You have to be able to describe it and to do so in a way that people are confident that it is a project that you want to contribute to it, which you certainly did with me, and I'm really proud that you did, and grateful to have been part of it. Leah, I want to come to you because I imagine that you had to think really hard about whether you wanted to participate in this project, whether you trusted the filmmaker to tell the story authentically, whether you wanted to revisit this period of your life and so much of the pain that became part of your activism that was also a part of your life. So walk us through how you thought about this, how you came to be approached to be in it, and what at the end of the day made you say, yes, this is the way to move forward to tell my story.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for this opportunity, Professor Crenshaw. It's an honor to be able to meet you and to chat with you today and to be on this panel with my friends. That question just took me back to sitting in Sheri's apartment. I guess I don't even know when that was now, Sheri. I mean, it's fuzzy now, but it was the first time we sat down to talk. I can't remember how we connected initially, so Sheri might be able to fill in the blank there. But I remember from the beginning thinking, she really cares and she gets the struggle. She's coming to this from a place of thoughtfulness and a sensitivity around trauma that was important to me. And at the time, I think between that natural connection that we made initially and also the advocacy work that I was doing, I felt obligated in a sense to have this piece of the conversation. I mean, I was nervous talking about some of these things because at the time I was still evolving as an activist, and I'm guessing I was in my 20s at the time, my late 20s, and navigating my own healing journey while I'm trying to advocate on behalf of others that haven't yet found their voice or haven't yet found a way to be heard. And so this was just an opportunity to amplify my own voice and to advocate on a greater level. And I'm just grateful that Sheri had the sensitivity to really hear me as a young Black woman and say, okay, we need to amplify this narrative.
Did you have any doubts at any point about, do I really want to?
I think I did. I mean, and that primarily came in when I was like experiencing burnout. I mean, I just was at a place in my brain where I was like, I don't want to do any of this stuff, but the conversation is so crucial. And then I have my own frustrations around it and the things that I experienced in the philanthropic space and activism space that were disempowering, as a person of color. And so I knew it was necessary. Mm-hmm. And there's always people that take hits at the forefront of revolutionary movements and conversations. And so I knew there was some sacrifice that came with it. And I still stand on the fact that it's worth it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The film shows you as the gifted activist, the public speaker, the charismatic personality that you are. At what point did you realize that you had this gift, that you could make people see, make people feel, make people accountable to things that they hadn't seen, hadn't felt, and hadn't been accountable to and for before they encountered you?
That's a wonderful question. And I can preface my answer with, I failed public speaking the first time that I took it. But it was because insecurity and internalizing experiences such as the ones that I've had will cause you to question yourself or not really even see your own gifting. And I think my grandmother, who was a prolific storyteller, and she taught me how to tell stories as a kid. And so that storytelling and the development of that started with her. And I think once I started having opportunities to speak, which actually started in church with my spiritual community and my pastor just pushing me on stage and, nurturing me through my anxieties around being on display for people. And then once I started to see, oh my gosh, people of all walks of life are connecting with the reality of my narrative. Mm-hmm. And I have a voice that I didn't realize that I had, and people are listening, and this can invoke, significant change. And it's something that I love to do. I mean, whether I'm talking about this subject or any other subject, I love engaging with people in this way. So, yeah.
And it was important to mark, because, the journey, your journey, we don't see the journey into becoming a public activist, a speaker, someone. You are that from the time we meet you. What your journey is through that to the life that you have now, the life of being an artist. So it was fascinating to watch that and to see your grappling with, I think I can come to a point where I can move to the next chapter, giving yourself the license to move to the next chapter. And I think that was particularly powerful. And Holly, you had a journey also in the film. So we see you at the very beginning, and you're a superhero. Basically, you're swooping in. You're on the rescue. Whatever it takes was basically the rallying cry. And I think for many people, that resonated too. It's like, yes, whatever, get out there. Let's put them all in jail. We really need to, more law enforcement is the solution. And now you've come to, I guess, a more subtle place, a different place for sure, and you're working in a different place. So I first want to get a sense of how you experienced, because this clearly meant that this film was made over a period of time where you start one place and then you end somewhere else. So how do you experience sort of observing your own development on screen where millions of people are watching your trajectory?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Dr. Crenshaw, and for this question, this framing. It's definitely vulnerable. It's a vulnerable place to be. And my relationship with vulnerability over the course of my life and the course of this film has ebbed and flowed. But where I've landed now is that if my vulnerability and, sharing of my journey and the complexities that I've had to wrestle around with in this movement work are supportive of other people doing the same, then it's worth it, When Sheri came to me with a camera in hand, I had been at the Oakland Police Department at that time for over a decade. And I had been an investigator. I had been an undercover officer in the work. I had advocated for policy. I had run the child exploitation unit. And I thought I'd given up on media as a medium to try and tell the story of what I saw was going on.
And why? Tell us why you've given up, because I think there's a there that warrants us diving into.
Yeah, thank you. I had given up on the media, I thought, because of the salaciousness in which they wanted to cover the story. They wanted to ask the questions about the police arrest. They wanted to film the search warrant service. They wanted to see an exploiter of color, a man of color, in handcuffs. They didn't want to talk about root causes. They didn't want to talk about my observations around the racialized nature and the disparities in terms of who was being victimized. They didn't want to talk about it. And when I did talk about it, I always found it completely cut out of the final product. So with Sheri, I actually don't even believe I started there. I took her call as an obligation as part of my job. And when she showed up, I thought, I'm going to spend 5 minutes telling her what she wants to hear and sending her away. But she was digging into those questions. She was asking me about root causes, and she was asking me about racial disparities and what I thought about those things. And so that became, the foundation of the film and of our work together. But as you mentioned, I definitely journeyed through lots of changes during the course of this film. When I started, what you saw was definitely, the superhero version of myself. And what I knew at that point, what I knew experientially as a Black girl, and what I saw immediately upon being a part of such a large system, the carceral system, and specifically being a part of and a witness to policing, is I knew that Black girls were not being protected or served, right? I saw that every single day. I saw it when there was a missing persons report of a 14-year-old Black girl versus a system's response to a missing person of a 14-year-old white girl. I understood that there were racialized systems responses anytime police officers had discretionary decision-making. And so I positioned myself as the hero, both in terms of fighting to protect Black girls from the system and fighting to protect Black girls from exploiters, from pimps and purchasers. What it took me many years to come to understand was that all of the things that I understood about root causes and historic oppression and systemic lockout, all of the things that I knew to be true for Black girls was also true for the Black boys, who were most oftentimes the street level exploiters that I was coming in contact with during my investigations. You know, and I think that Sheri captures that really, really well in the film, is, you know, that moment that I had that realization. And it was a very hard truth, because I'd spent so much of my time positioning myself as a hero and really working hard to go after exploiters.
And so you've come out in a different place, still doing the work, but approaching it differently, which we want to come back around to. I was particularly struck by your reflection on how police officers valued bodies differently. You know, for a Black girl, they'd look for a couple hours and then go home. And for a white girl, they would not go home, you know, until she was found. And it struck me. I thought about Gwen Eifel's labeling of the missing white woman syndrome. I mean, that is, all the press is stop, everybody stop, we have to find her, but not so much as a bleep many times when it comes to Black girls. So witnessing the obvious hierarchical difference in value from inside the system, and then seeing how it plays out outside. That had to be, really, first of all, frustrating to see, and almost like, trying to spoon out the ocean with a teaspoon, right? So when I guess, how do you think about when you finally got fed up with it and said, there's got to be another way? Was there anything in particular with respect to the hierarchy among girls, or where Black girls were placed that you saw, that you said, okay, that's it, I can't be done in this way?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I think, it was a buildup of reflection and observation of the system and its limitations and the harms that it continued to perpetuate against the Black community over time, and, in the film, I talk about the pivotal moment in which I interview a young teenage Black girl who'd been exploited and trafficked. And I hear from her life story. I hear the trajectory from when she was 4 years old and was involved with child welfare, through, the arrests as a teenager for small things, being put on probation for theft and car theft, but everyone along the lines missing her actual victimization and missing the need to protect her. And then I leave that interview and I go in and I talk to a young Black man who tells me the same story about his life. And in that moment, I just realized the gendered nature of how trauma manifests. And that's so oftentimes, as women and girls, we internalize the messages and internalize our oppression. And it sets us up to be very, very vulnerable to all of these things. And that oftentimes, because of the way that we socialize males, they externalize their trauma as violence against other people. And I just thought, this is not the answer. And it's not a complex enough response. And there's so much resource going into policing and prosecution, and hardly any resource going into prevention and intervention, right? And making sure that as a community, we have everything we need in order to be healthy and safe. And so, those were the things that really went into my thought process when I decided to resign from the police department and move into community-based work.
And, you know, Sheri, I was also struck by the description of Oakland and other communities as victim-rich urban environments. So I'm wondering.
That was actually Holly's framing. I thought that she has so many brilliant like one-liners in the film, but that's something I remember very vividly.
And so did you come knowing that what you were interrogating was the intersectional dynamics that produce these conditions that create the opportunities for predation? So I'm hearing from the initial interview that, you know, Holly was thinking, okay, just another media thing. I know what she wants. I'm just going to give it to her. But obviously, in that moment, you were signaling a broader vision, which, you know, obviously produced a broader response from Holly about what this issue was looking like. So, where and how did you differentiate your project from so many of the, you know, approaches from the media that we've seen and roll our eyes at, because we know it's not getting at, it's not being driven by serious concern about the girls and the women, and B, it's going to wind up being just a simplistic, let's go arrest them kind of thing. So how did you step into it with that broader vision that you wanted to explore in the film?
You know, I think really like the work that I did at Covenant House really impacted me and informed my understanding of the root causes, and also like how I wanted to approach the film. And really, you know, something that was very clear to me from the beginning was that I wanted to tell a story that was reflective of the dignity and respect and compassion that the girls deserved. And so, and also, you know, based on everything I had already seen in terms of media representation, or the majority of media representation and advocacy work, you know, it was operating in this very colorblind way. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, why, you know, and I knew, you know, like a lot of times movements are led by people who have lived experience. And that's true for the domestic violence movement. It's been true for, you know, like cancer research and so, you know, I thought, why aren't Black girls' voices and experiences being centered here when they're the majority of people who are impacted by this crime? And, you know, there's a lot of victim blaming and shaming that happens. And most of the, like I said, most of the media that I saw around the issue was just reinforcing a lot of racist tropes around hypersexuality of Black girls, adultification of Black girls, and just assumptions made about their pain and their, you know, trauma. And so like my objective was really to create, you know, a story and narrative that was humanizing and that came from a place of love. Yeah.
And, you know, you mentioned the data, and I just want to mention it again, that 92% in LA of girls who are involved in trafficking are Black or of African descent, 63% in San Francisco. The numbers, I mean, I was struck in Seattle, 46%. There aren't that many, I mean,
I lived in Seattle. It's a very white city. It's almost unthinkable that the percentage would be that high.
Exactly. Like how is this even impossible? And yet, you know, it clearly is. So we have, I sometimes call this sort of the double intersectional failure. Number one, there's the structural dimensions of vulnerability, as Holly says, the victim-rich conditions, you know, of possibility that reflect a range of dynamics, but, patriarchy, misogyny, racism, classism, the deprivation of public resources, the shifting of life affirming resources to policing. All of these are rich environments that create the conditions and the very possibility for this kind of exploitation to happen and for it to be targeted on particular girls. So that's the first level of the structured dimensions of it. And then there's the representational dimension, right? The fact that in telling the story of trafficking, those who are most likely for it to happen to are the ones who are least invited to tell the story, most likely to be marginalized. And so I see both of these as part of the intersectional vulnerabilities that play out and that the film is drawing attention to. And I'm wondering at this point about the representational stuff. So Sheri, you've mentioned, Holly, you've mentioned, and Leah, you've also hinted a bit about the philanthropic sort of frame that complicates the ability to get at this. What is behind the colorblind frame on trafficking? What is it that consistently seems to require you to fight to be able to occupy this space and demand accountability as a Black girl, right? Now as a Black woman. So where are the moments where the expectation that this be a colorblind narrative was experienced by you, Leah?
That's such a wonderful question, and it's brought up so many different thoughts. I mean, I remember when I first started feeling the rumbling of wanting to address this and fearing that if I overemphasized it in the spaces that I had access to, that it could potentially damage or prevent or hinder the movement somehow. I mean, honestly, it just in my mind, and that's, internalization of the environment that I've come up in, where just this shame, almost like it's like a spot on our community, a blemish on our community, or what does this say about us? I mean, I had so many different thoughts and feelings and anxieties. And then I was in spaces where I heard, white leaders make comments regarding what they felt like the face of this issue was. I mean, I literally verbatim heard someone say, that was a philanthropic leader, say 98% of these pimps are Black and they're coming after our 12-year-old white girls. I heard those exact lines. I was, 27. I was just starting off in the movement. So that it was so incredibly painful. And it wasn't an accurate statistic, but it was being used to fearmonger and to honestly, in my opinion, to get donations. And so, all of that created, at least for me personally, and I think Sheri and Holly can speak beautifully to this issue too. For me personally, it just created some sense of angst. And I think that was one of the reasons why the film was so valuable to me on a personal level, was it was the, you're safe. It's okay for you to talk about this as it is. This is not just some sort of, thing you made up in your mind. And this is reality. And we're going to acknowledge what's actually going on. And I also, at the same time, because I care so much about the issue in general, I never wanted my sisters and brothers with lived experiences that are not African-American to feel like this, talking about it in this way is somehow elevating our suffering above theirs or diminishing, the reality of what they've experienced. But I'm also, at this point in my life, I'm also really tired of the censoring and the feeling like I gotta apologize for what I'm advocating for, when what I'm advocating for is for humanity. I mean, I know we categorize and things like that, but we're just talking about people at the end of this day. At the end of the day, we're talking about people and people needing to be advocated for and supported and loved and treated with dignity.
This brings me back to a piece that I wrote many years ago called Mapping the Margins. And I was struck by how advocacy for the Violence Against Women Act began with a kind of gesture very similar to what you experienced with the effort to frame trafficking as, in a way that would that would motivate people to give money by sort of projecting it as in the familiar trope of Black male predation on white females. The parallel, though, was this. The senators were saying, domestic violence doesn't just happen in the streets of urban America. It also happens in, the Tony homes in middle-class America. So it was sort of an appeal to the white male senators that seemed to acknowledge, we know that this problem exists, and we know that the problem exists to those other women. But in order to get you activated to care about this, we're going to tell a story about women that you should care about more. And that's going to generate the intervention that will do the work. And of course, the reality is if you make that default, if you try to tell a story about, white slavery as the earlier framing was, it's pretty much guaranteed that whatever is going to come from that is not going to trickle down to the girls who are already devalued, whose devaluation is part of the vulnerability that's a condition of the possibility in the first place. It's sort of like they're conceding, we don't really have to worry about these, but we really want you to worry about these. And so I'm wondering, also, Holly, you had mentioned you'd witnessed this kind of demand of colorblindness. What piece of it did you see that limited the ability to actually paint the full picture of this issue?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think from my lens, being involved in the early 2000s, at least in Northern California, was when the anti-trafficking movement was really picking up steam, and we were really developing system responses and changing the language and doing their early work. And the anti-trafficking movement was living side by side by the gender-based violence movement, which was heavily controlled and run by white feminists, right? And as we've seen in the past, mainstream white feminists, tend to center themselves and control the narrative, and then invite a couple Black people to the table and believe that that's solidarity and movement work. And so, that's what I saw. And another part of that I think is really important to mention here is that because of that, the early trafficking organization, Missy, the first trafficking organization in the Bay Area, Missy, lived at the Family Justice Center, which was, a carceral system controlled space. It was the district attorney's space. And so because of that, for a very long time, the anti-trafficking narrative has been heavily influenced, and in some spaces completely controlled by the carceral system actors. So police and district attorneys defining, the problem, defining the victims, telling us what the solutions and resources are. And I think related to what we were talking about before, with the systems, the carceral systems failure and inability and refusal to see Black girls as in need of protection, that talking about what we're talking about now is, the numbers are overwhelming. But I think what they were doing is they were adultifying Black girls, and they weren't seeing the large majority of Black girls that were coming through the system as actual innocent victims, right? In line with what we now have, the research and report by Georgetown, on the adultification of Black girls, that shows that Black girls are perceived as early as age 5 to be less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers, that Black girls need less nurturing, less protection, less comfort, less supports. So that was what I saw playing out with carceral systems in the early years, and which I was so happy to be a part of this film, to really try and intervene and to break that narrative down.
And Sheri, I was really struck as well by the origins of the frame in the language of whiteness, the language of, this is modern slavery, or more specifically, this is white slavery. How much do you see that framing as continuing to contribute to the erasure of Black girls as some of the primary abused girls who then are caught up in trafficking?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think that even the term that people often use, modern day slavery, is a bit problematic.
Yeah.
And certainly using the phrase white slavery, just to be honest, seems a bit absurd.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that a lot of times people want to focus on, the exploitation happening in, and by African-American men and men of color in terms of exploiters. But, like any other part of the economy, there is nothing happening without demand.
Yes.
And 85% of the men who purchase sex online are white men. And so really, instead of vilifying young African-American men for being the exploiters, I think it's pretty clear why at a legislative and policy and advocacy level, we're not focusing more on the issue of demand. And part of that is because at all levels, ministers, judges, policymakers, senators, filmmakers, and all the rest, these are also men who are exploiters and are also purchasing young girls and don't want to be called out on their own behavior.
Yeah. And, at the same time, I am mindful of some of the pressure, Leah, that you mentioned, like you don't want to draw attention to those purchasers who are, members of our own community, or those men who are involved. I remember at our Breaking the Silence Los Angeles a couple years ago, we had a panel of young women who were basically being asked some of the, typical questions, like, why didn't you leave? Why didn't you, speak to your minister? Why didn't you speak to your principal or the dean in your school? And to a person, one said, my trafficking began in church, which shocked people. And another said that one of the most respected members in the community was one of her buyers. And so there was this hidden in plain sight dimension of the testimony that I think was shocking to people. But, the real question is, does the shock turn into activation? Do you really open your eyes to see what's in front of you? One young woman talked about how she'd been flown from one part of the country to another with men who, someone should have asked the question, what are you doing with this girl? And nobody asked. They just, took it as a given. So I guess what that made me wonder is how little do people really understand about the pervasiveness of trafficked girls, and how much stereotype gets in the way of them knowing or being able to see, who some of the buyers are, how deep into respectable communities as it goes, does this go, and how it makes it that much harder to really address it at its roots.
I think on the one hand, I have to just pause and honor all of the work that's been done to highlight this issue. I think we've evolved exponentially since I was a kid. So I I go to a hair salon, for example, and there's a human trafficking poster in my salon, where had that existed when I was 15, life may have looked different for me. So I just want to honor how far we have come in our response to this issue. But then there's also the issue of sensationalism, and then people just kind of I've seen a lot of people get caught up in fear and not facts, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like you'll get some random thing on social media that talks about a woman somebody spraying perfume on her and kidnapping her from a parking lot. And you're like, oh my God, okay. This is part of the problem, because if the sensationalism is a huge issue, but then on the other extreme of that, you have the desensitization. Like, one of the things that I was thinking about is how it affected me to have to watch a known trafficker be on television as a cop now, and going and doing interventions with human trafficking victims on television. And it's just like, okay, so you have these two extremes. And I think that makes it confusing for people. I think there's a general lack of understanding. I think people they think force and they think kidnapping. I think that's an easier way, I think, at times for people to try to understand what happens versus the intentional and insidious mental manipulation and the vulnerability of youth. I feel like, I don't know. I mean, I used to think, when I was a kid, I used to think I never want to be like these adults that forget what it's like to be a kid. I remember thinking that, and I think people don't generally understand adolescent development or child development and the delicateness of a child's brain and a teenager's brain, and how influential that period of time can be. And no matter how developed they may appear to be, they're still children, and they need to be protected by us.
Yeah. And not punished. So Holly, I wanted to, also pick up not just the parallels, but the intersections between criminalizing our youth and vulnerability to trafficking. So you mentioned the adultification from the Georgetown report, which really put words to experiences that girls have been telling us, for a generation. A few years before, the African American Policy Forum issued a report called Black Girls Matter. And we were interviewing girls who had been expelled or suspended from school. And to a person, there was some version of adultification being, expressed there, either being totally left to their own devices and only getting attention when they acted out. And sometimes their acting out was an expression of traumas that were happening to them that nobody picked up on. So there were no resources in the school, to deal with some of the early traumatic experiences that Black girls were having. But there were plenty of resources, including police officers in the school, to march them out and into the juvenile justice system when they actually, demanded the kind of attention that that only got criminalization as a response. So I guess there's a sort of a question, like when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Mm-hmm. Even when you're in schools, even when you're dealing with children. So I'm wondering whether in the period of time that you were there and now since, how have you seen the intersections of criminalization of Black girls and their vulnerabilities, some of which create a pathway to exploitation?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That's really important. I mean, so many ways. I mean, I just saw it play out within the carceral system day in and day out. One example I can think of just not seeing Black girls' humanity or vulnerability was, as a new police officer, I was working, in the east side of the city, and that's a side of the city that has been known for sideshows, illegal car racing and street racing has been a part of the youth culture in Oakland since I was a kid for decades. And so, we were tasked with policing the sideshow event and making car stops on cars that were driving fast, et cetera. And this one particular evening, I responded to a call and was backing up a white male officer who had pulled over a car of young, about 17 or 18-year-old white girls who were out in Oakland at about 2 a.m. They weren't from Oakland, but they were participating in the sideshow. He gave them a very stern warning. He explained all of the dangers of young girls being out in East Oakland in the middle of the evening. And then he provided them with an escort to the freeway to go back home. About an hour later, I responded to back up that same officer who had pulled over a car full of Black girls about the same age who were also not from Oakland. And what his response to them was towing their vehicle and attempting to lead them on the side of the road at 2 a.m. alone by themselves to fend for themselves. And so, I had to intervene in that situation. But I mean, that's an example of a system that says it's there to serve and protect, really not being there to serve and protect everyone. And, along the lines of what you're talking about in schools, very, very similar situation. I've had a lot of intersection and work with, the school districts in my area. And we know that school engagement is a protective factor for girls. And yet Black girls are being pushed out of schools, right? The work that you've done has shown that. The work that Dr. Monique Morris has engaged extensively has shown that. I'm currently working as a community-based researcher at Bright Research Group. And a few years ago, we engaged in research at our local school district and found very similar negative treatment of Black girls by the adults in the school. And really, what is happening is that society is denying Black girls humanity and then failing to protect their childhood and then pathologizing their adaptive behaviors and punishing them for surviving. One striking finding from the work with girls in schools was that teachers were labeling them as loud and commenting on their difficult, aggressive natures and attitudes, us knowing attitudes being a code word, like an early version of the angry Black woman stereotype. And then when we asked Black girls their perspectives, they said that they were protecting themselves from constant sexual harassment because the adults would not intervene and protect them. So we have failures to protect in all of our systems, carceral systems, education systems, healthcare systems, social services systems, and punishment of Black girls' attempts to creatively support themselves. And I've seen that over and over again. And I think that that's, what we're touching on here in terms of the pipeline from systems that are supposed to be systems of support that fail, and then that acts as a vulnerability in a pipeline to trafficking.
So every part of that. And just to put, a point on it, and you mentioned Dr. Morris together, we did a focus group, and one girl told us that her first suspension from school was because a boy was harassing her, and she responded and she was suspended. Another girl was put out of school because she was distracting to the boys. I mean, so it is in many ways the classic intersection of a punitive environment, which is racially coded, and then a gendered vulnerability to the zero tolerance in a context in which the girls are not going to be protected, so they have to protect themselves. It is, sort of the classic equation that leads to their marginality, separation from school, and numerous consequences. So I'm wondering, and Leah, you had said we're at such a different point now than we were, several years ago. So I'm wondering what is giving you a sense of possibility now, either things that you are seeing now that the movement is beginning to embrace and to make real as possibilities, or even in thinking back in your own life, what would have, made a difference either in school or in loved ones in these systems that we're talking about that just churn out Black girls? What are you seeing or hoping or imagining that can make the difference in the trajectories that we are talking?
What a question. And I got emotional listening to Holly talk because it just caused me to reflect on my experiences. I mean, I dropped out of high school in the 9th grade and actually the beginning of my sophomore year, excuse me. And I had experiences that were very similar, you know, trying to fight off boys in class and cussing boys out and then getting kicked out of class. And, you know, my little tough, my attempt to regain power over the situation was to just leave. Well, it's like, well, you're not going to kick me out of class and make me stand in front of this classroom when I'm being harassed. And I would just leave, you know, and I haven't thought about that in a long time. So I got a little choked up just processing through that. When I think about our evolution and I've seen, although I understand what some of the, and obviously to no way and to the extent that Holly does, and I understand that there's issues within our policing, but I have seen officers like Holly once was from all backgrounds, white men in the uniform, advocating for victims and displaying a level of sensitivity that I never personally experienced when I was being detained and arrested when I was a juvenile. And that may not quite yet be our norm, but the fact that there are people that have evolved in their understanding and are displaying compassion. And I had those experiences running a direct service program in Sacramento. And so having to do so many interventions with young people that had been trafficked and then watching the cultural tide start to shift and turn as people were becoming more empathetic, especially in law enforcement, that's been really inspiring for me. Seeing our systematic responses, I mean, the coordinated efforts that happen across our country to ensure that there's placements and economic empowerment opportunities for victims of human trafficking. I mean, it's a dream, you know, and sometimes I get frustrated with the younger folks that I come across with lived experiences because I feel like, man, you guys have access to all this stuff that we didn't have access to. So I've had to learn from them, you know, I've had to learn from the younger generation on, you know, ways for me to grow in empathy and compassion. You know, I'm not immune to losing compassion and empathy and getting frustrated just because I've been through some stuff. But so seeing all of those things and then knowing, being privy to the evolution of the movement, I'm not as involved as I once was, but because of my time in the human trafficking movement, I developed relationships with so many incredible people that are doing great work all over the country. So I get to hear about, you know, the things that people are dreaming up and doing. And so I'm very, very hopeful. I think what I'd like to see along the lines of our conversation is specialized support, unapologetic, specialized support for African-American girls. In every sense. I mean, not just for those that have my experiences, but I've had to have some very painful conversations with, you know, Black girls over the years that have been trafficked and create safe space for them to have conversations about the reality of what they've gone through and what it felt like to be devalued in comparison to a white victim, right? I want that to be a regular and a comfortably addressed part of the conversation. Because it would always catch me off guard that there were advocates fighting for this population that were just oblivious to this reality. And it's like, well, that may be because you haven't, you know, had the understanding or created the safe space for them to be able to talk to you about it. They may be more inclined to talk to another Black person about their reality because they just don't feel like you know what's going on. So I think we still need to grow in that. I think the film is contributing to that. I know that there are nonprofits that are serving this population that are watching this film. So that's very inspiring for me as well.
And you put a point on the need to have culturally competent and gender competent interventions, people who are deeply informed and capable of speaking to, providing support and services through that lens that allows them to see fully the girls that they're dealing with. And I will say, as far as that's concerned, there is the sort of the problem of colorblindness in shaping interventions for trafficked children, but there is also a gender blind approach to Black children at risk. By that, I mean, actually, it's not even gender blind, gender specific. So one of the ways and reasons that we got involved in this is that so much of the conversation about vulnerability has almost been exclusively boys. And that vulnerability is real, particularly if we take into account the school to prison pipeline and criminalization. But it also means that a whole range of vulnerabilities that are disproportionately, not exclusively, but disproportionately made up of girls and non-binary youth is not included in our conversation about youth at risk. So it's a multiple sort of intervention that needs to be made. We need to think about how race shapes trafficking, how gender shapes some of the most challenging circumstances that face some of our girls. It's a multiple-sided call that we're making. And so on that, Holly, now that you are in a new space in terms of the work that you're doing, what do you see as some of the most promising ways in which some of the lessons that you have now learned and internalized are now being centered in the newer attempts, the efforts to figure out approaches to the subject of child trafficking?
Yeah, thank you. I think what's standing out for me right now at this moment, because of the national conversations about reimagining policing, is really the opportunities in reimagining public safety and like really coming to understand as a collective what survivor-centered safety and healing looks like. And so that means that they have to be at the table and they have to be centered in those conversations. I think that we've done a really decent job as program providers and as community-based workers and healers of centering survivor voice and needs in our program models. And now we need to take that to the next level, which is as we're having these conversations about reimagining public safety, that we need to be centering survivor voice in defining what that looks like for them, right? And then putting the resources and reallocating the funds to those things that survivors are saying they need. And I think what stands out most to me about this and what I'm hopeful about and what I hope that we can all continue to really push on is this, that's gonna require us to reframe trust. I think that a lot of times, particularly in community-based work, we're talking about trust. We want the clients to trust us, right? We have to build these trusting relationships. And we're referring to building trust with our clients and gaining their trust. But as we know, trust has to be mutual. And when we're in privileged positions and positions of power with decision-making ability and access to resources, we have to pay particular attention to building trust for survivors, right? Because when we trust, we don't hold on to power. And power over and domination is the language of the patriarchy and colonialism. And we are professing to fight that. And so I think for me, I'm really excited about the ability and the possibility of using our privilege and seats at the table to bring survivor voice and survivor needs as they define it into these conversations about reimagining public safety.
Yes, yes. And Sheri, where is the passion and where is the work taking you? What is your current hope and the work that you're doing?
Well, Holly and I are actually co-founding a new venture together because we've become very close friends over the course of the last, 8-9 years and have lived a lot of life together. And I think that right now it's an important time to seize the moment. This year has brought a lot of unique opportunities where equity movements are intersecting with increasing political will and a heightened level of consciousness. And so really reimagining what our world could be, and not just the absence of injustice, but like really the presence of love and care in our system's responses. And so Holly and I have started an organization called All In for Justice. If you're interested in learning more, you can go to the Still I Rise website at stillirisethefilm.com and click on the link to All In for Justice. And we basically, we want to continue to build and strengthen our partnerships. We want to educate and train the media on how to ethically report on sex trafficking, especially as it pertains to African American communities. And, we want to design and implement and co-create, artivism and skills-based training for social change with impacted youth. And so that's really the direction that we're moving into now, is like, how do we take the work and elevate it?
So we will drop a link to All In for Justice so people can follow your work and get involved. Last but not least, Leah, what are some of the current projects that you would like to lift up?
Well, thank you for asking that. And I'm so excited about All In for Justice. Let me just say that. It just made me think about how divine it was that, Sheri had the boldness to connect with Holly, and Holly's openness to participate, and now look at them, so that's super exciting. I accepted a position as an executive director of a nonprofit here in Dallas, where I live now. And the focus of this organization is providing leadership development support to executive leaders of nonprofits all over the nation. We were started by a for-profit consultancy that focuses on health and well-being and healthcare transformation. So I really am in a position, and the organization is called Health Movement, by the way, but I'm in a position to sort of marry my passion for underserved communities and then my deep understanding now of the needs of executive leaders of nonprofits, and leverage the collective talent that we have access to that can support them and ensure that they have the unique support that they need, because leading a nonprofit is challenging. And so people get really inspired by the work, but then they don't know just how intricate it is, and also how painful it can be for the leaders. And I don't want to overlook, the reality of the people that make the mission possible. I've always been a person that really cares about my team, but I also know how isolating and lonely the leadership role can be. And so it's exciting to be able to support that. And I'm still singing, I'm still singing and playing the guitar. And I actually sing at my church here in Dallas, which has been so much fun. I've realized that anytime we focus too much on one aspect of our identity, we can get sick, And so I had, in the previous season of my life, everything was about the work. And I've learned that I'm more of a dynamic individual than I think I was able to acknowledge at that time. And I needed to nurture other aspects of myself to stay healthy. I mean, music and yoga, all of those things are ways to emote and to express that our people have always engaged in. I had a conversation a couple years ago with a former civil rights leader, Dr. Flonzie Brown Wright, and she talked about the role that music played for them, the way that they were able to stay inspired. And she gave me permission to rest. She said, "Baby, we couldn't rest so that you can." Yeah. And so I'm doing a fusion of serving leaders and focusing on the artistic and healing parts of myself, but getting a lot of rest and saying no to a lot of stuff.
And so important. I think one of the things that was actually inspiring about the arc of your story is giving people permission to say, I've done what I am doing here, and now it's time for me to do something else, knowing when that time comes. So that was a gift to, I think, many activists. And as an executive director of a nonprofit, I may be getting in touch with you. So thank you so much. So I want to thank all of the guests for taking the time to share their experience, their thoughts, their honesty, and their essential work with us, their contributions, along with all of those who have participated in our week-long Her Dream Deferred series, deepened our understanding of the ways in which Black women and girls confront multiple and overlapping oppressions, encouraging us to celebrate their courage and their creativity. And I hope it activated all of us to find or forge pathways to building a social infrastructure where Black women, girls, and femmes experience the caring, respect, and justice that we all deserve. So this event and this entire week just couldn't have happened without the amazing team at the African American Policy Forum and the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies. If you missed one of Her Dream Deferred events, all of our amazing panels and talkbacks are currently available for re-watching on AAPF's YouTube channel. So please go over there, check it out, subscribe, do all the stuff that they say to do to keep the channel up and running. So stay tuned to AAPF's social media channels. That's at AA Policy Forum on Twitter and Instagram, as well as mine. I'm at Sandy Locks on Twitter and Kimberlé Crenshaw on Instagram. Additionally, as a special and much needed bonus, we are extending this year's Her Dream Deferred to discuss and practice rituals of self-care and healing. So join us on Tuesday, April 6th, for an event focusing on Black women's mental health, self-care, and empowerment. You can find the link and details and also register at aapf.org/events. Lastly, if you have been inspired by this week of events, if you want to partner with us to sustain these vital conversations, do consider donating to the African American Policy Forum at aapf.org/donate. And you can write us at info@aapf.org to find out other ways to get involved. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining us this week. We hope you found the events as enlightening and as inspiring as we did. And we hope you'll continue along with us as we continue to uplift the stories and the status of Black women. Thank you.
Some babies running out of time for waiting. Freedom and triumph, they weren't meant for me. Girls of my color, find something else to be. I'm better, I'm better, I'm better, I'm better, I'm better, I'm better. I'm better, I'm better, I'm better, I'm better, I'm better, I'm better. I'm better, I'm better. Something only bodies heal. Promiscuous holiness, hope is slippery. I got all this time to kill. Something like a prayer to kneel to. lay on my pillow.